Chapter 11. As the other commandos gathered, Blaine bit off another inch of sticky plug and moved out impulsively, scanning the tangled jungle with his rifle, desperate to take revenge. The whole time he was sputtering to himself about the bastard rebels he planned to skewer on his machete and send to hell for the barbecue. Anyone and anything in his path would be dead meat, he promised Hawkins silently. Yet even in his rage he paid acute attention to any tip-offs the jungle might offer of enemy presence. A snapping twig, the glint of a gun chamber between the branches of a rubber tree. A minute later, he was obliged by a rustling deep in the bushes 10 yards ahead. Carefully, silently, he pulled the rifle sight to his eyes and focused the crosshairs in the direction of the noise. "Come on, you shit-eating mothers!" he hissed with a mad grin, anticipating revenge. "Let me see you fuckfaces so I can fill you full of holes." And he began to squeeze slowly on the trigger, waiting in a kind of rapture for the right moment. He expected a terrorist, maybe two, maybe more. It didn't matter. A dozen would suit him just fine. He'd let go the whole round in a second and make garbage of all of them. The sound grew more distinct, and Blaine held his breath to steady his aim. "Come on, fuckers. Come on right in," he whispered. "Old Painless ain't got no patience." Suddenly, sounds of a charge, and a small tapir burst through the leaves, whinnying with its ears back as it scampered across the clearing and dived through the high canyon grass. Blaine winced, then exhaled in deflated surprise as the animal disappeared from sight. "Shit!" he cursed, exasperated. His body, tensed from head to toe in hyper-alertness, relaxed at the sight of the animal, going almost limp from the anticlimax. But just as he permitted his senses to rest and go off alert, he felt a curious piercing burn across his shoulders. And echoing, like a mockery in his ears, he could hear Hawkins' voice, sounding almost as if he were underwater. "Hey Blaine, you ever heard of a toothbrush?" Blaine looked down, bewildered, in the direction of the sting, and he saw a gout of blood erupting from a tear in his shirt. He spun around, raising his rifle a second too late, only to be greeted by the alien spear streaking towards him like a guided missile. The creature attacked in its own concept of time, a blurred streak inhumanely fast, measured by the millisecond. The razor-sharp weapon entered Blaine's back at the base of the spine, ripping through the spinal column with a force so awesome it cut through bone and burst out through his chest. He just had time to let out a half scream that drowned out all the rest of the jungle, the screeching parrots and blue-haired monkeys, the million cicadas whizzing their legs. Grotesquely, the tip of the alien spearhead pierced Blaine's heart and rocketed it out of his body, the organ attached to the tip like a macabre trophy. 100 Mayan priests sighed in their temple graves. Then the deadly weapon slammed into the side of a bamboo tree, and the heart exploded in a bloody pulp that clung to the bark, the veiny red flesh as weird as an alien presence itself. Blaine's body, which stood dead on its feet for seconds that would have seemed like hours to an observer, at last keeled over onto the ground. The cavernous hole through Blaine's chest was big enough for the tapir to crawl through. Close by, Mac heard the short burst of Blaine's wail and scrambled up the canyon towards the sound. As he charged into the clearing where Blaine had stood moments before, he saw nothing but a newly roughed-up track of dirt. Then beyond, the alien spear still vibrating from the impact with the tree. With his M22 readied, Mac stalked closer in time to hear a strange, wet, sucking sound, like a famished peasant pulling a bowl of soup to his lips. He stopped for a second and listened, bewildered, then pushed aside a red fern leaf and saw the retreat of the mighty two-legged creature. Not ape, not man, but warrior without a doubt, as it raced off into the trees. Laying on the ground just inches away was the shell of Blaine's body. Mac looked down and saw his partner's deflated corpse emptied of its organs, a kidney and a few feet of intestines strewn nearby, dropped accidentally by the monster as it flashed away. The commando choked and could feel the banana he'd eaten before the rebel attack erupt into his mouth. He turned his head aside and blew out the sticky, half-digested yellow mass, then shook his head, and sobbed out loud, wiping his stinging eyes in disbelief. Yet he quelled his grief quickly in favour of a passion for revenge. He pulled his wits together, drew his rifle to his chest, and aimed nakedly in the direction in which the alien had fled. As he blasted into the trees, he shouted a wild and primitive war call, not a cry he'd learned in basic training, but one that came directly from the soul, the unconsolable wail of agony when a man loses a brother. He emptied the entire magazine at his waist before thinking to call out to the others. But it didn't matter. Every living thing within a radius of 2 miles heard Mac's raw scream and the explosion of gunfire. Immediately, the commandos were on their way, tearing through the brush in a kind of frenzy, as if they barely had a second now to tie a tourniquet on this nightmare. When Mac's ammunition was exhausted, he reached down and grabbed up his buddy's rifle, which had snagged on a bramble during the havoc. Once more, he poured the ammunition into the black-green vegetation, riddling the trunks of trees and scattering nests and bursting seed pods, as if the jungle itself must die for this one. His glazed saucer eyes were possessed as he swept the gun back and forth across the path. Whatever reserves a man can muster, Mac burned now with a white fire, then summoned more to burn again. In his crazed state now, he would happily level the entire country and all the rotten dictatorships bordering it, if necessary. Anything to wipe out the wrongness responsible for his best buddy's murder. The other commandos were zeroing in on the site one by one, erupting out of the choking brush. "What the hell's going on?" Ramirez bawled to Mac, shouting to compete with the deafening crack of bullets ripping from Blaine's rifle. Mac screamed back without a second's holding fire. "It got Blaine!" he cried. "Run that way!" And he let off another stream of bullets into the splintered grove of bamboo to point the way. "Let me give you a little light," Ramirez hissed with an edge of black humour as he released his grenade launcher and whooped 2 volleys into the jungle. Seconds later, a pair of deafening explosions sent fragments of dirt and leaves and sticks everywhere, knocking birds from the air as the canyon roared with a phosphorus light. Then the blinding chaos was followed by the stunned silence of aftershock, as if the whole world had paused for a breath of grief. The alien, racing among the trees, stopped in its tracks as the white flash from the grenade explosion short-circuited its heat-seeking vision, momentarily paralyzing it. As it froze in a crouch, a shard of shrapnel zinged through the air and managed to lodge in its thick-hided shoulder. It barely felt the merest twinge of pain, but the gash was deep enough to cause a glob of blood, a thick, translucent amber jelly, to splash on the leaves of a kingfire bush. The group of men, now including Schaefer and finally Dylan dragging Anna along behind, stood wide-eyed in the clearing, ears ringing painfully as they waited for the jungle to settle. For a moment, the only movement was the pale blue smoke wafting from the end of Mac's rifle, and every one of them looked as if he hadn't a clue where to go from here. Their dozen wars suddenly amounted to nothing, and their massive kills and their awesome bravery and luck were as meaningless as the random swarms of bees that floated like liquid gunfire in the deep of the woods. Anna suddenly broke free from Dylan's clench on her arm and wobbled over to Blaine's body as if she were drawn by a kind of spell. As she looked down at the mangled flesh, her eyes glazed over in renewed terror. But this time she didn't go rigid with shock as she did at Hawkins' run-in with fate. Schaefer watched her carefully, knowing the girl's recollections and Mac's report might shed some light on the workings of the enemy's mind. As Anna stared, transfixed in horror, the Major glanced between the two witnesses, impatient for some answers. Mac spoke first. I saw it," he stammered. "What? Saw what?" "I saw it," he repeated dully. "Fucking thing." And his voice trailed away, as if there were no more words to describe it. Then Mac and Anna, both looking down at the body, simultaneously raised their heads. They locked eyes in recognition, as if they shared a common secret, the same thing that had cut both their tongues. Schaefer's patience was spent. He turned to Mac and shouted, "Mac! Mac! Look at me, goddammit!" The brute soldier stared ahead dumbly, his face numb with shock. He'd shot all his bullets. His power was over. and his rage was useless. "Who did this?" Schaefer demanded, shaking him by the shoulders angrily. Suddenly Mac was furious too, as he groped his way out of his trance, furious because he had no explanation. "I don't know what the fuck did it," he said with disgust. "Something terrible. Big, like a gorilla, only it didn't have no hair. I saw it, Major. I saw it," he insisted, almost pathetically, as if fearful no one would believe him. As Mac was struggling to describe the alien, Ramirez, who'd been nosing around the immediate area, came running back to the dwindling group. "Nothing, Major. Not a fucking trace," he reported in a rage of frustration. "Like they all disappeared in a hole in the ground." The stunned and bewildered commandos instinctively moved closer to Schaefer, gathering round him as if to draw comfort and direction from their leader. Schaefer looked up at the yellowing sky, now beginning to roll with heavy dark clouds, the day fading into a dusk that would grow no cooler, only wilder. "We're losing the light," he said quietly. "I want a defensive position set up at the top of the ridge. Empty all your pockets. We're going to need everything we got." Mac, agitated to such a pitch that he growled like a cornered puma, forced himself to get calm again, at least enough to get back to business. "Yes, sir," he replied vigorously to Schaefer, relieved to dive into a project and distract himself from his grief and rage over Blaine. Even Schaefer was nervous, though. He'd realized this elusive enemy was a tactical magician with tricks up its sleeve they hadn't even dreamed of. Shreds of evidence were slowly, if vaguely, piecing together, confirming Billy's far-out notion that some kind of unearthly killer was on the loose. As the jungle grew swathed in shades of purple, the Major knew his team would be ever more vulnerable to the mysterious predator who was picking his men off, one by one. And the most unsettling thing was this. Schaefer had always been able to understand before exactly why an enemy hated him. They shared their opposite sides of a war and fought as best they could, as heroes. Here he was sure of nothing whatsoever. The enemy came from nowhere, and it had no army, and it had no country, and it had no creed, and it had no mercy. Urgent as the time was, Schaefer felt compelled to allow Blaine a last dignity, however makeshift, before setting up camp for the night. "Put him in his poncho liner, for now," said the Major, pointing towards the ravaged body. "We'll bury him in the morning." "I'll take him," Max said urgently, determined to cover his buddy, even in death. And while Mac attended to the cerements, the rest of the commandos climbed the steep canyon to the campsite Schaefer had chosen. Anna, her eyes drawn to a nearby bush, wandered slightly away from the group, unnoticed by the others. They all understood she was too freaked out to flee, but this was no attempt to escape. She had noticed the queer glimmering spot of orange among the leaves. As she approached the bushes, she reached out, her fingers hovering over the leaves where the alien's blood gleamed, its colour and iridescence like a distillation of all the jungle's mottled orchid hues. Tentatively, she touched a fingertip to the sap-like glob, then drew her hand close to her eyes and examined a drop of it as curiously and innocently as a child pinching the wings of its first butterfly. Anna had not quite returned to the real world. Though functional again, she had preserved some part of herself in a distant and safe buffer zone in her mind, soothing as a fairy tale. She was insulated now from the full screaming terror she'd witnessed earlier, and her fascination with the amber depths of the alien's crystalline blood was a way of pretending the nightmare never happened. As she vacantly studied the odd substance, sniffing it delicately, Dylan came up behind her. She looked up with a smile as he motioned her to return with him. Shrugging like a child, Anna passively obeyed, absent-mindedly wiping her sticky fingers on her fatigued pants. Then Dylan and the newly docile Anna, the antithesis now of the fiery Amazon who he'd taken at the guerrilla camp, walked silently back up the slope to the others. The commandos had begun to establish their defensive camp in a dense grove of firs that abutted a solid wall of canyon rock. They had already dug makeshift foxholes, and Ramirez and Billy and Mac were kneeling in theirs, weapons cocked and ready. Their sweaty fatigues were well suited to the high country surroundings, the greens and browns fading with the daylight, the dark tones all merged in a way that seemed almost magically unified. Except that by comparison, the alien's capacity for camouflage was light years ahead. Dylan helped Anna step into a shallow foxhole, where she huddled in her dreamlike state, rocking in a slow and methodical way, like a mental patient on high-dose salts. Now and then she looked down at the alien bloodstain, which glowed sweetly in the gathering dark, with a faint orange luminosity. Slowly, she moved a hand towards the spot and stroked it lightly, then caught her breath with a shiver, as if a memory of the brutal attack on Hawkins had rushed to the front of her mind. Then the next stroke seemed to calm her down, and she fell into a peaceful doze. Nearby, Mac was stringing a tripwire low to the ground, covering it with leaves and grass. After completing a wide circle maybe 50 feet across, till there wasn't a single break surrounding the site, he moved into camp and reported to Schaefer. "We got most of the flares set up," he said, "and 2 claymores just outside. Nothing's coming close without tripping on something." "Good work, Sergeant," Schaefer acknowledged curtly, his mind trying to process 100 details. Then, suddenly sensitive to the bond that lay broken between Blaine and Mac, he added softly, "I'm sorry, Bull. It's never easy. He was a good man. I never had no brother. He was it." Mac replied simply, almost matter-of-factly. His lips tightened as if to contain his emotions. Then he walked back over to the poncho containing Blaine's body, where he had left it lying at the edge of the camp. He pulled back the zipper to reveal Blaine's face, which looked peaceful in death, as if lying in state. The weapon had done no damage here, and the nightfall pale of the last light made the grey of death softer. Gently, Mac reached a hand into Blaine's shirt pocket and pulled out the flask they had shared earlier in the day. The worn chrome was rubbed away, revealing the brass beneath. Mac rolled up a shirt sleeve to expose the cleaner face of the rough cotton and carefully rubbed the flask in a circular motion, as if he were polishing a valuable piece of jewellery. The outline of the insignia, 101st Airborne Division, was still visible on the side. It was the company that Mac and Blaine had served in together in Nam, 14 years before. He removed the cap with a priestly dignity and raised the container to his lips, taking a swig of the sour mash whiskey, careful to leave enough for another hefty shot. Then he replaced the cap, lifted the flap on Blaine's shirt pocket, and gently pushed the flask back into place. "I don't know where you're going, bro," he said, "but 2-bit says you can use this." Then he lingered a moment and saluted his friend one final time, then zipped the poncho shut. The dark had fallen completely now. "Adios, buddy," he whispered.